Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another week of our Cybersecurity Executive Brief. I am Corey Wolf, Director of Offensive Security here at Risk 360, and today is Wednesday, July 3rd. The big one that you probably have seen something about this past week is regression. So there have been multiple threat advisories put out by multiple organizations. Qualys was the organization to first release a threat advisory on this particular issue. At the end of the day, the story is the world is ending. It's all over. We're done for. Everything's vulnerable. Well, that's not true. I lied. The truth is that there is an issue called regression, which is a vulnerability in openSSH. They rate it as a critical vulnerability. I'm not so sure I would go that far, but which we'll talk about in just a minute here. But what this is this is a regression of an earlier CVE from 2006, I believe. If we go down, let's see here. I believe it's from 2006. Yep, CVE 2006, right? So this is a race condition in openSSH. The affected versions are very specific. So it's openSSH 8.5p1 to 9.8p1. There is a proof of concept released. It is out on GitHub right now. However, to exploit this particular issue, this race condition issue, it will take multiple hours and multiple login attempts to try and gain remote code execution. So yes, there is a POC. It is out there on the open internet. But if you're allowing your openSSH hosts to have all kinds of random connections coming in for multiple hours, I think you got bigger issues. This, again, is a race condition, which means that they need to hit the vulnerability at a specific time. Timing is essential when it comes to race conditions. And so in this case, if we look specific conditions for exploitation, target must be running vulnerable version of openSSH. The attacker needs to time their exploit precisely to hit the race condition window. Multiple attempts are typically required. Just because it's a race condition, you typically have to anyways. The exploit leverages specific behaviors of glibc's memory allocator, making it primarily effective on Linux systems. So this is basically a Linux issue, not a Windows issue. So if you have openSSH on Windows, running one of these versions, not necessarily that you shouldn't be worried about it, but the risk is much, much lower on Windows systems. You'll never hear me say it's zero. You'll always hear me say it's much, much lower on Windows systems. If we look at the exploit mechanics, we're not going to do a crazy deep dive into how to exploit a race condition and memory allocation. But what we will say is if we look here under timing and duration, on average, it takes about 10,000 attempts to win the race condition. A full exploit could take 6 to 8 hours on average to obtain a remote root shell. So, is this an issue? Absolutely. No question about it. Should you be able to identify 10,000 attempts on openSSH within a 6 to 8 hour window? I would hope so. I would hope so. If not, you should probably look into either some sort of host-based EDR for Linux. I mean, there's lots of them. The funny thing is that there's almost never EDR on Linux, but there are EDR versions for Linux. Also looking at things like ingress points and doing network detection on the ingress points, as well as just host-based firewall stuff, right? So you really should be able to identify you should be able to identify 10,000 attempts within a 6 to 8 hour period on an openSSH server. At the end of the day, if you are not running, openSSH 8.5p1 to 9.8p1, you are not vulnerable to this issue. But at the end of the day, it is an issue, although I wouldn't I wouldn't say it's a critical. That's just me. I mean, it's just a lot to exploit this. And it's a lot to exploit this and fly under the radar for those organizations that do have basic implementations in place to identify things like brute force attempts or anomalous network activity, that kind of thing. So check it out, read a little bit more. There's more information in the description if you'd like to read up on it. Another thing we want to talk about, you might have heard over the past week or two that the ransomware crew Lockbit claimed to have ransomed, or I should say exfiltrated data from the Federal Reserve. They did not. So Lockbit is notorious for making wild claims, like they invented the question mark. Shout out to Preston Pierce, who got my reference in my LinkedIn post about this. Lockbit makes all kinds of crazy claims. There's been a lot of back and forth over the past 4 or 5 months between Lockbit and the FBI in particular, to where in March, I think, sometime in Q1, a joint task force, the Kronos task force between the US, the UK, and Eurojust took down Lockbit's infrastructure. So they gained access to Lockbit's infrastructure. I'm sure they gathered intelligence for who knows how long, and basically shut them down. Lockbit made a resurgence, came back. The FBI then doxed the leader of Lockbit, a gentleman named Lockbit Sup, put his photo everywhere, everything about him. The FBI also started to help organizations decrypt their information because I'm assuming through the intelligence that they got when they first took down Lockbit's infrastructure in Q1, they were able to build a decryptor. So they started to help organizations decrypt their data that was encrypted by Lockbit, announced this publicly. Lockbit, of course, is pretty salty about this. And so now Lockbit came back and said, hey, we got the Federal Reserve. Well, no. What they got was a bank called Evolve Bank. I believe the full name is Evolve Bank and Trust. Evolve Bank, interestingly enough, was, I don't remember exactly, but I believe the Treasury Department or the Federal Reserve, I mean, they're the same thing, but I don't remember which actual organization did it. But Evolve Bank and Trust got reprimanded in some way for having lapses in compliance in basic security practices. They did this, I don't know, a few months ago. Evolve Bank actually was cited for this. And now, of course, Lockbit releases the data. One of the big organizations affected by this, of course, as you can see on your screen, is Affirm. Affirm is a buy now, pay later company, which used Evolve Bank and Trust for various financial transactions. And so if you were to look at the Lockbit, which, by the way, the Lockbit, I've been trying to go and view the Lockbit blog on their Onion site. Haven't been able to get to it since this whole Federal Reserve thing happened, which is interesting. You can get to their Lockbit file share. That works, but their overall blog and where they release victim data, you cannot get to them. So most of the mirrors are just down, or there's somewhere, if you try and visit that Onion site, it's actually asking you to authenticate with a private key. So funnily enough, ever since this happened, it's been really tough to get to Lockbit's leak site. I don't know what that means, if that's law enforcement or not, but at the end of the day, Affirm was one of the organizations affected by this Evolve Bank and Trust data breach, and they have alerted their customers. So apparently Evolve Bank and Trust has not been doing the do, as they say, when it comes to compliance and security, and Lockbit goes ahead and breaches them. I don't know if they had a full-on ransomware incident or if Lockbit just released the data. I believe Lockbit just exfiltrated data. There's evidence that the stolen data includes names, social security numbers, bank account numbers, and contact information. As you can imagine, a bank is a juicy target, and if you're able to gather information from a bank, that's pretty good. So just more in the Lockbit and FBI back and forth. Lockbit continues to push forward despite all the actions by law enforcement through shutting down their infrastructure. releasing information on their personal identities. Lockbit continues to push forward, and this is just another example of it. So that's what's going on with the Federal Reserve ransomware, if you've heard about that in the past week or so. Last thing I want to talk about today, in January of this year, Microsoft, so in January of this year, a Russian nation-state threat actor had the keys to the kingdom. They were walking around Microsoft's corporate tenant and had full access. So we actually did what did we do? We did a training in March of this year where we walked through the attack. That is on YouTube. I'll include that in the links in the description as well. But in March of this year, Risk 360, we did a working lab session where we talked through this full attack of the Russian state APTs, how they performed the attack, what they could have done, and then we actually opened up a lab to where people could go and try the attack themselves. At the end of the day, Russian nation-state threat actors had a group known as Midnight Blizzard had full access to the Microsoft corporate tenant. They were reading emails. They were gathering intelligence. Microsoft eventually found them, gave them the boot. They talked it down very much so. They played it down quite a bit in January and February. And when you actually walk through the attack like we did in our working session for the public, mind you, for the working session, if you walk through the attack, it was clear that the threat actors had much more than just basic access. And at the time I said, well, this is much bigger than Microsoft's letting on. If they were able to do, so for example, the threat actors created an application in the Microsoft corporate tenant. And if they were able to do that, that meant that they could basically do whatever they wanted throughout the tenant. They had specific permission levels that if they were able to create this application, they were more than likely able to access everything in the tenant. The other thing they did was they were able to grant themselves Exchange admin. So if they can grant themselves Exchange admin, what else can they do? They can pretty much do whatever they want for the most part. Microsoft talked it down. Well, what do you know? Last week, they alert additional customers of state-linked threat group attacks. So this keeps happening. Every few weeks, something a little bit more comes out about this particular attack in January. And it just keeps getting worse and worse, honestly. So what I would recommend you do is you look through this attack executed something called a service principal abuse. And so what it really boiled down to was a app registration in the tenant that had elevated permissions. So if you're concerned about these types of issues, like what this nation state did to gain access to the Microsoft corporate tenant, you should do an inventory of all your enterprise applications in your tenant, as well as any other third-party applications in your tenant that might have been granted access through, an admin or any user really in your tenant if they have the permissions to accept third-party applications. So do an inventory of those applications in your tenant, both ones that you've created, as well as ones that you have allowed access into your tenant. But again, more and more keeps coming out about this, and it keeps getting worse. So there's linked more reading in the description if you want to read about it. I will also link to our video where we go through this particular attack that gave the nation-state threat actors access to the corporate tenant and how they did it. So I would check that out as well. But yeah, continues to get worse. Microsoft's pretty quiet on the topic, but then they keep spitting out little bits and pieces. So I think this is going to keep going. We're going to learn more and more as time goes on. So that's it for this week. Again, July 3rd. I hope you have an excellent 4th of July, a great long weekend, and we'll see you here next week. See you soon. Thanks for watching. For more content like this, make sure to like and subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on LinkedIn, and visit us at risk360.com to learn how we can help your business succeed.